The sign appeared on a Tuesday morning. White post, red letters. For sale. I noticed it through my kitchen window while my coffee was still hot, steam curling up like it always did, like nothing had changed. For a moment, I thought it had to be a mistake, a neighbor, a mix-up, anything but what my eyes were telling me. Then I saw my mother on the front lawn, smiling at strangers, pointing toward my driveway like she belonged there. By the weekend, people were walking through my living room, opening doors, asking questions. They weren't selling a house, they were selling mine to pay for my sister's dream wedding. From the outside, my life probably looked unfinished. I lived alone, I drove an older car, I didn't post much online, and when I did, it was never about achievements or milestones. No glossy vacations, no captions about success, just quiet updates, if any at all. To my parents, that silence meant uncertainty. Carol liked to say I was keeping things simple, the way people do when they're trying to sound supportive while lowering expectations. Thomas nodded along, convinced I'd eventually need help, financial, emotional, or both. When relatives asked about me, they'd shrug and say I was still figuring things out. They thought I needed them. They thought the house I lived in wasn't really mine, not in the way that mattered, just a place I'd landed for now, something temporary, convenient. When my mother talked about it, she always framed it that way. Hannah's staying there for the moment, as if permanence required permission. I never corrected her. Not because I was hiding, but because I was watching. I wanted to know how I was treated when I wasn't impressive, when my worth wasn't obvious. I wanted to see who respected me without knowing the details. Lily never questioned it either. She was too busy planning her wedding. Venues, menus, guest lists that kept growing. Every family conversation revolved around what she wanted, what she deserved, what this once-in-a-lifetime day needed to be. And I helped, quietly. I always had. I just assumed that when something involved me, someone would ask. I didn't realize they already had an answer. Lily's wedding wasn't just a celebration, it was a production. Every detail had to be perfect, or at least expensive enough to look perfect. The venue had chandeliers and a waiting list. The catering menu changed 3 times because the first 2 didn't feel special enough. Even the flowers became a debate about status, not taste. Carol treated each upgrade like a necessity. You only get married once, she kept saying, as if that single sentence justified any number that followed. Thomas worried out loud, but never enough to say no. He preferred quiet agreement to conflict. Somewhere along the way, need turned into entitlement. At Sunday dinners, the conversation stopped being about whether Lily's plans were realistic and started being about where the money would come from. Not if it would come, just how. They spoke in assumptions, not questions. I noticed how often my name appeared without anyone looking at me. Hannah doesn't really need all that space, Carol said once, stirring her tea. She's practical. Thomas added, she'd understand. Family comes first. They never asked what I understood. They never asked what I was willing to give. Lily sat there smiling, overwhelmed and glowing, caught between excitement and expectation. I don't think she meant to be greedy. She just grew up believing support would always appear when she reached for it. And I had always been part of that support. Quiet, steady, unquestioned. So when the wedding needed everything, it didn't sound like a problem. It sounded like a decision that had already been made. I didn't realize how far they were willing to go to make it happen. They told me over dinner, the way people share information they believe is already settled. Carol had just cleared the plates when she said it, casually, like she was commenting on the weather. We've been talking, she began, glancing at Thomas, and we think selling the house makes the most sense. For a moment, I honestly thought she meant their house. I looked up, confused. What house? Your house, she implied without actually saying the word. Thomas nodded, already committed. It's a smart move, Hannah. You don't need all that space, and Lily's wedding costs aren't small. I reminded them, calmly, that the house was mine, that I owned it, that it wasn't for sale. Carol waved it off. Don't be dramatic. You're living there because it's convenient. You can find an apartment. Thomas added, You've always been flexible. This is just temporary. Temporary. The word landed harder than they realized. I tried to explain not just the legality, but the principle, that this wasn't about money, that decisions involving my life shouldn't be made without me. They didn't listen. They spoke over me, around me, as if my role was to absorb the outcome, not influence it. Lily stayed quiet, eyes on her plate, already overwhelmed by a plan that was moving faster than she could control. That was the moment I understood something important. They weren't asking for my help, they were informing me of my role. So I stopped arguing. I stopped explaining. I nodded, finished my meal, and let them believe what they wanted. Because sometimes the most powerful response isn't resistance, it's letting people reveal exactly who they are. By the time the open house started, I had already said everything there was to say. I stayed upstairs while strangers filled the rooms below me, their voices drifting up through the vents. They talked about lighting, layout, resale value, words that felt oddly invasive in a place that still held my routines, my quiet mornings, my sense of safety. From the landing, I watched Carol move through the house like a professional. She smiled easily, gesturing toward windows, describing upgrades I'd paid for. Thomas followed behind her, answering questions with a confidence that bordered on entitlement. I heard the lie before I saw it. The current occupant will be moving out soon, Carol said, her voice light. She's been here temporarily. Temporarily. I pressed my palm against the wall, grounding myself. My name wasn't spoken. My presence was erased with a sentence. People stepped into my bedroom, opened my closet, commented on the space as if it were already theirs. I felt strangely calm, like I was watching a play I already knew the ending to. Downstairs, Lily laughed nervously, trying to keep up with conversations she didn't fully understand. She looked overwhelmed, but not enough to stop it. My phone buzzed with messages from the family group chat, excitement, champagne emojis, talk of offers. Someone mentioned a deposit. That was the moment something shifted from emotional to unmistakably real. I walked back into my office, closed the door, and opened my contacts. I didn't scroll, I tapped the name I'd saved for moments when calm mattered more than anger. Evan. My message was short, direct. They're selling my house. There's an open house happening right now. I think they've taken money. The reply came almost immediately. Stay where you are, he wrote. I'm on my way. I set the phone down and looked around the room one last time. They thought they were selling a house. They didn't realize they were selling the last illusion I had left about my family. I didn't pace. I didn't rehearse what I would say. I sat at my desk, hands folded, listening to the muffled sounds of conversation downstairs, doors opening, polite laughter, the soft shuffle of strangers moving through my life as if it were inventory. Calling Evan wasn't an act of anger, it was an act of clarity. When he answered, his voice was steady. Talk to me. They're hosting an open house, I said. They told people the house is available. I just saw someone hand my father a check. There was a pause, not hesitation, just calculation. Do they have any legal authority? He asked. No, I said. None. Good. Then don't interfere. Don't confront them. Let them continue. I closed my eyes, understanding immediately what he meant. Are you close? I asked. 20 minutes, he said. I'm bringing everything. Title records, purchase documents, and I'm asking for an officer to meet me there. I thanked him and ended the call. Downstairs, Carol was laughing again. Thomas was explaining square footage. Lily was smiling too tightly, caught between excitement and nerves. They thought momentum was on their side. They thought silence meant permission. I stayed exactly where I was, watching the clock, knowing that for the first time that day, I wasn't reacting, I was waiting. And sometimes waiting is the most decisive move you can make. The front door opened without hesitation, not the polite knock of a guest, not the tentative pause of someone unsure they belonged there. It opened with purpose, cutting cleanly through the low hum of conversation. Excuse me, a calm voice said. May I have everyone's attention? The room went quiet. Evan stood in the entryway, jacket still on, a folder tucked under his arm. Beside him was a uniformed officer, neutral expression, hands loosely clasped. The contrast was immediate, legal certainty walking into carefully staged chaos. Carol froze mid-sentence, her smile still half-formed. Thomas took a step forward instinctively, the way he always did when he thought authority was being challenged. "This is a private showing," my father said. "You can't just—" "Yes, I can," Evan replied evenly, "because this open house is being conducted illegally." A ripple of confusion moved through the room. Someone laughed nervously, assuming it was a misunderstanding. Evan opened the folder. "The property at this address is not for sale. The individuals hosting this event do not own it and have no legal right to represent it as available." Carol's face drained of color. "That's ridiculous," she said quickly. "Where her parents?" Evan nodded once. "And she's an adult." He turned slightly, his voice carrying. "The legal owner of this property is Hannah Moore. She purchased it outright. Title is clear, no liens, no shared ownership." Every head turned toward me. Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it. Lily looked between us, confusion hardening into something closer to fear. The officer stepped forward. "Sir," he said to my father, "have you accepted any money today from potential buyers?" Thomas hesitated, just long enough. "Yes," he said, "a deposit." The word deposit landed like a crack in glass. "For a property you don't own. That constitutes fraud." The room went silent. No polite murmurs, no laughter, just the sound of a truth finally spoken out loud. Evan closed the folder. "This open house is over," he said calmly, "effective immediately." Silence settled over the room, thick and uncomfortable. Evan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply opened the folder again and continued, as if this were a routine explanation, because for him it was. "Hannah didn't inherit this property. She purchased it with her own funds. No cosigners, no family assistance." Carol stared at the papers like they might rearrange themselves into a different story. "That can't be right," she whispered. "She never said—" "She didn't need to," Evan replied. He turned another page. "What she also didn't announce was that she's been covering the rent on the condo you live in, below market value, for years." My mother's hand went to her mouth. Thomas looked suddenly unsteady, like the ground beneath him had shifted. "And the monthly transfers?" Evan continued, glancing briefly at Lily. "Those weren't gifts from a relative or savings that appeared on their own. They came from Hannah." Lily's face went pale. "You mean from her?" she asked quietly. I nodded once. No explanation, no defense. Evan let the moment breathe before adding the final detail. "Which means today wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was an attempt to sell an asset that never belonged to you, while relying on the same person you assumed would quietly absorb the loss." No one spoke. Not Carol, not Thomas, not Lily. The image they had carried of me, the confused daughter, the temporary occupant, the one who would always adjust, collapsed under the weight of facts they'd never bothered to ask for. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt clear. They hadn't misjudged me by accident. They had built a version of me that made their choices easier. And now, standing in the wreckage of their assumptions, they were finally seeing the truth. Not because I raised my voice, but because I let the right ones speak. I didn't ask Evan to press charges. When the officer looked at me and asked how I wanted to proceed, I shook my head. The room exhaled, relief passing too quickly across faces that hadn't earned it. "This isn't about punishment," I said calmly. "It's about stopping." Evan nodded and stepped back, letting me speak for myself. I explained what would happen next, clearly, without emotion. Any money that had been taken would be returned immediately. The listing would come down. The open house was over, permanently. Then I drew the line they hadn't expected. "I won't be funding the wedding anymore," I said. "Not because I'm angry, but because the assumption that my life is available for everyone else's use ends today." Carol started to cry. Thomas looked at the floor. Lily stared at her hands, shame replacing excitement. They insisted that it was not a misunderstanding, and they had made some unassuming mistakes. They thought momentum was on their side. They thought silence meant permission. No one argued with my decision. When they started to apologize, I asked them to pause and think about it. They aren't the bad ones. They're just people who never had to think twice about the implications of their actions. I know that. I know that's not a reason to allow it. I learned that I can allow people to be easier without giving up my own stability. I learned that their actions didn't have to be my own suffering. Today was the end of it. There's something about knowing you had the power to cause damage and choosing not to use it that feels more powerful than any show of anger. I let them go, living with the choice they had made, and not forcing them to adopt mine. Lily waited until the house was empty before speaking. She found me in the kitchen, sitting at the table where we'd shared so many ordinary conversations growing up. Her eyes were red, makeup smudged, the excitement she'd carried for months finally gone. "I didn't know," she said softly, "about any of it." "I know," I replied, "and I meant it." She sat across from me, hands wrapped tightly around her phone. "I never asked where the money came from," she admitted. "I just assumed that it would work out." That assumption had protected her from having to think too hard. It had also cost us something. "I don't want to lose you," she said. "I don't want our relationship to be about money." I studied her face, really looked at her, not as a bride, not as the center of everyone's attention, but as my sister. "So it can't be," I said. "Not anymore." I told her what I could offer and what I couldn't: support without obligation, presence without expectation, a relationship that didn't depend on me fixing things behind the scenes. She nodded slowly, understanding settling in. "I can have a smaller wedding," she said after a moment. "I want you there more than I want a venue." That was the first choice she'd made that day that felt like her own. And for the first time in a long while, I believed we might actually be family, on different terms, but honest ones. That night, after everyone had gone, I walked through the house alone. The rooms felt different, not because anything had changed, but because I had. The walls still held the same quiet, the windows still caught the same evening light, but the weight I'd been carrying for years was gone. This house had never just been a place to live. It was proof of work, of choices, of a life built without permission. They tried to sell it because they thought I would shrink to make things easier. Instead, I stayed. Some houses aren't for sale, and neither is the dignity it took to earn them. If you've stayed with me until the end, I want to thank you, not just for listening, but for seeing me. This story wasn't about a house, it was about what happens when you finally choose yourself after years of being convenient for everyone else. If you believe I did the right thing, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you don't, tell me why.